My name is Catherine King, and we are thrilled to be part of the Asia Pacific Architecture Festival and the broad program of events on offer this year. Today's discussion focuses on the Queensland Cultural Centre, and I'd like to welcome our panellists, Deborah Vanderplat, Michael Rayner, Ruth Woods, and Lloyd Jones. I'd also like to welcome our audience, those here in person, and those joining us via live stream. And I wanted to let you all know that we'll be taking questions at the end of today's discussion. Before I hand over to Lloyd, I just need to run through some housekeeping for everyone here at Runcorn. Please, everyone, ensure that your phones are turned off. I hope everyone has signed in with COVID, our COVID sign-in, just as you enter the building. We have bathrooms located back out through the foyer and to the left. And in the event of an emergency, please follow QSA staff, myself, David and John here in the room. So really, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Lloyd. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. So good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you again to today's discussion, Queensland Cultural Centre, Then, Now and New. So my name is Lloyd Jones, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's panel discussion. Joining me is Ruth Woods, Dr. Deborah Vanderplat, and Michael Rayner. Our aim today is obviously to discuss the past, present and future of one of the state's key cultural assets. So Ruth, just do a little introduction of all the panellists. Ruth Woods is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects, a practicing architect working in heritage for over 30 years, and was a member of the Queensland Heritage Council from 2002 to 2009. Ruth has won awards from the Australian Institute of Architects and the National Trust for her adaptive reuse and conservation projects, and was appointed as the Heritage Architect to advise the state government on the heritage background and issues associated with the Queensland Performing Arts Centre and the new Performing Arts Venue competition. Deborah is a senior lecturer and former senior research fellow at the School of Architecture at the University of Queensland. Her research examines the intersection of climate, race, place and taste in the 19th and 20th century. Writing new histories of Queensland architecture has also become a focus in her work. She is the recipient of several key grants, most recently Brisbane's Radical Houses, Oral History in Architecture, and the Life and Work of Robin Gibson and Partners. Deborah has widely published and has received multiple awards for her publications. She is the editor of two forthcoming publications on Queensland architecture, the first on Robin Gibson, co-edited with myself, and the second on the emigre architect Karl Langer, which is edited with Professor John MacArthur. Both will be published in 2021, hopefully. Michael Rayner is a director of Blight Rayner Architecture, which he formed with his partner Jason Blight in 2016. He was previously director of Cox Rayner Architects and was responsible for several of Queensland's public buildings, spaces and master plans, as well as significant public projects in Singapore and China. He is a past president of the Australian Institute of Architects for the Queensland chapter and a former member of the Premier's Smart State Council. Michael is an adjunct professor at both the University of Queensland and Griffith University and a member of the Queensland Urban Design and Places panel. In 2011, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for his contributions to the built environment of Queensland and the Queensland community. So my interest in Queensland's post-war architectural history stemmed from my research during my Masters of Architecture at the University of Queensland. I was involved in the Hot Modernism exhibition at the State Library and also the Digital Archive of Queensland Architecture. In 2018, I received the Young Achievement Award at the National Trust, Heritage Awards, and more recently, the Guildford Bell Travel Scholarship from the University of Queensland. And at the moment, I'm trying to finish a PhD on Robin Gibson and Partners. I know that a lot of us probably are familiar with the Queensland Cultural Centre and have seen the buildings and sort of know of the new Performing Arts Venue project. But for those of us joining from outside the region, the Queensland Cultural Centre is essentially a cluster of cultural buildings that were all designed and constructed by Robin Gibson and Partners and built during the 1980s. So this part of Brisbane was during the 19th and sort of early 20th century, was home to various facilities, Trocado and Sant, Blue Moon skating rink, and the Cremorne Theatre. So there was a sort of existing history of cultural sort of facilities on the site. Initially, it was just going to be an art gallery, which the model of is in the exhibition out front in the foyer. But in 1975, the brief was substantially expanded to include not only the art gallery, but a performing arts centre, a museum, and a state library. So the complex was designed as sort of a cohesive group of buildings, all designed in that sort of lovely concrete with sort of recessed glazing and inbuilt planting as sort of a cohesive landscape on the bank of the Brisbane River. It also sort of acted as a catalyst for future development on that site. So we had the Expo in 1988, and it has since sort of transformed into the South Bank Parklands, which is one of the most substantial kind of public spaces that Brisbane has. So today we aim to discuss the architectural and social significance of the existing Robin Gibson design infrastructure, the changes that have and are taking place on that site, and the developing nature of the architecture of Brisbane's cultural institutions, and what that might mean for the people of Brisbane. I also believe today might be the first time that the new performing arts venue has kind of been openly discussed in this sort of public forum. Is that sort of right, Michael?
Possibly. Well, been some other talks, but yeah.
So it's a good opportunity to sort of pick Michael's brain about the design of that project. So I thought I might just sort of kick off this discussion with a sort of open question to all the panelists, some of whom were sort of Brisbane born and bred, while I think Deborah and Michael have both come in from interstate, about this sort of like individuals' sort of first or lingering impressions of like the Queensland Cultural Centre. So I think for me, it existed maybe first when I was a kid. I grew up in Brisbane, and so it was perhaps the Queensland Museum that I went to first. And I suppose it's been fortunate that as my kind of interests in culture and art and performance have sort of grown, there was facilities for those interests to sort of develop into. But Deborah, you're only, you've been in Brisbane for 15 years or something now.
I'm a newbie.
Yes. Yeah. So what was your sort of first impression of the?
Well, I moved to Brisbane, I think 2006, 2007, and I had never been before. My husband had got a job here in Brisbane. We sort of fluctuated between two cities trying to decide what we were going to do. We had a small child, and we had to choose a city before she went to school. So I didn't know Brisbane at all. The company Gordon worked for had set him up in a service department in the city. So it was really the CBD in that city area that I first got to know. So it was just wandering around that city. And wandering around the CBD, Queen Street Mall, and then the Cultural Centre and South Bank, especially for a small child. South Bank was a definite place to go. So now that I think back, I'm really quite taken that was the two spaces that really grabbed me and sort of gave me the first impression of Queensland or Brisbane, not Queensland, of Brisbane as a city, were places that were built by Gibson or designed by Gibson. And I hadn't realised that at the time, and I only had come to that realisation sometime later when I started working at the School of Architecture and started working in writing histories on Queensland architecture. And that first space was Queen Street Mall. Wandering around, you know, coming from Sydney, wandering around the CBD of Brisbane on a weekend, thinking, where are all the people? And then turning from Edward Street into Queen Street Mall, and then wham, that's where they all were. That place was just packed. It seemed like the whole city was just in that space. It was so well used over a couple of blocks. There was just people. And then the other space I really remember sort of becoming acquainted with and really liking, and it's still one of my favourite spaces today, is the art gallery in the water wall. And I think at that time, or fairly close around that time, there was the Japanese artist installation, Narcissus Garden by...
Yayoi Kusama, is that?
Yes, which is the silver balls that were floating on the water. And I was quite taken with the installation, but I was also really taken with the space. So there's probably the two first impressions that sort of really stuck with me of Brisbane, and they were spaces by Gibson, and one of them was the Cultural Centre. There was the art gallery, Waterwall.
Yeah.
So,
Michael, you studied in Sydney, right? Were these projects sort of on your radar as a student?
Not in Sydney, not till I came in 1990 to Brisbane. So I really didn't know much about Brisbane at all, to be honest. Wasn't sure I was quite coming here. Nevertheless, I've enjoyed my life ever since, the last 30 years in Brisbane. I think the first thing I thought about the Cultural Centre was, how did one architect get all those projects? Because in Sydney, that would never happen. It's competitiveness and so on wouldn't enable it. So that's one of its great strengths, of course, is that it's been able to be one of the few cohesive precincts of a cluster of cultural buildings together, which, for other various reasons, politics included, just doesn't happen very much in the world.
And that's why it's significant too.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, that was the first thing. I guess as time's gone on, to me, there's a kind of conundrum about the Cultural Centre being a place of serenity in which to observe art, or a museum, or those things. So when you go there, it's not so much an escape, it's probably the wrong word, because it sounds like a resort, but I mean, there is an ability to sort of see that work without kind of feeling all sorts of other disruptions happening, and I really think that's a fantastic thing. Then, on the other hand, this argument about culture and cultural life and cities and bringing them together much more. So it's a two-way kind of thing, but I think it's still a very strong part of the cultural precinct that you can, it's not quite monasterial, but you can kind of really quieten yourself, calm yourself, and enjoy, and it will stay like that because of its sort of scale. And, whereas you've got fish lanes and all sorts of other things happening around it with huge amounts of buzz, but it will hopefully always retain that kind of ability to see art, in a very kind of calm state of mind. So that's what I like.
What about you, Ruth?
Well, I mean, having grown up in Brisbane, I remember the trams and Queen Street before it was a mall, and I'd finished architecture by the time the art gallery was in construction. But yes, the vision that Gibson had for all of those buildings, and the fact that he was able to implement them, is part of its significance. And you just have to walk around. Now, the Water Mall, I think, is considered one of the most important and beautiful spaces for its light. It's soft lighting, its ambience, its volume, which, very courageous that the government would take that on, because, so often architects are squeezed for space, and we could have put 2 stories, 2 other floors in there. But the fact he was able to convince them of that, and it is seen as one of the most beautiful public galleries, I think, in Australia and beyond. So it was eye-opening. And of course, Gibson's buildings very much are very conforming on the outside in terms of their form, very structured. There's the grid, it's very strong. But internally, it was another life throughout the spaces, whether it be the balconies or the steps on the side of QPAC, or the way he dealt with the internal spaces as well. And it was terrific as a young graduate, walking around the art gallery after it opened in 82, I think it was. And it was, very uplifting. Yeah.
Deborah, you sort of mentioned like the Queen Street Mall as another one of the initial Gibson projects that sort of sparked your interest or sort of awareness of Brisbane. So what else was Gibson sort of doing at the time in the 1980s?
1980s?
Yeah. I mean, he seemed to he was doing the Cultural Centre and a bunch of other things.
Well, I think Michael mentioned this too. It's amazing. He said it's amazing that one architect had control over that one precinct. And I think you can go back and say one architect had so much control over aspects of the city. I think that's really unusual, especially coming from Sydney. So there was the Queen Street Mall, there was Anzac Square, there was, a bit earlier. I think the practice is interesting and really significant for Brisbane, because it's a practice that's had its hands in so many different things, from small shops, shop fit outs, shops, shopping centres, through to creating pedestrian squares into commercial buildings. This idea of creating public space, I think, was an incredibly important one, and I think that becomes a big part of the vision for the cultural centre as well. He was doing churches early on. So I think this is what's really, what I find really interesting about the practice is that when they established you can give me the
58.
right date, thank you. When they were established, they started off like any other practice really in Brisbane doing small projects, but they quickly spanned out into the civic and into the religious and into the commercial and retail, and then ultimately up to the big civic projects. And that seems to have been a very deliberate and focused campaign, and part of what you're talking about, this vision he had for the cultural centre, but also the vision he had for the city. So, and one aspect I've always really liked about that, the cultural centre, is that part of that vision was bringing the river back into the city, which becomes part of the cultural centre. But it's also linking it into the public spaces that run right through the city. So you have the cultural centre, you have the bridge, the river, into Queen Street Mall, which takes you down to Anzac Square. So it becomes a sort of all interconnected whole, and the vision just kept growing. So I think that's probably, it's not what he was doing so much in the 80s. The 80s was probably the art gallery. It was what he was doing, what they were doing as a practice from the late 50s into the 60s, 70s and 80s. I think it has to be seen as part of a collective whole.
And as an architect, I think his practice was, highly revered, and it was always known, he ruled with a pretty iron fist, which is, I guess, how he was able to, some of the detailing that he worked with, and the people, Alan Kirkwood and people who were, well-renowned architects who worked with him for virtually most of his practice life. And it takes a lot of work to get those smooth lines, recessed details, everything lining up in the concrete and the glass, and he was a master of doing that, and he ruled the roost in that office, as I understand. It was people revered him in the office. He was a hard taskmaster.
He was I think with the detail thing, that's an interesting one, because there's this consistency through all the buildings. So once you got the detail right, unlike some other architects that probably think they need to keep doing things, he kind of flogged it, is probably the one way to put it, to the extent that it was so refined that that's why the quality was kept up. In lots of buildings, you get what's called value managed down, by contracts and things. Well, it's very hard if you've got the one detail running through to value management away. So he's probably pretty clever in the way he sort of kept the discipline going through all the time. I actually had quite a lot of interactions with Robin over the years. I came up just picking on your comment about what did you say about
ruling the roost in the office?
But I used to come up in the 80s sometimes with Philip Cox, who was my boss then, and I worked for Philip Cox and Partners, various names of that, before I changed 2016. So I'd come up as a young kind of graduate guy, and we would meet a couple of architects up here that Philip knew. And Philip was sort of friendly with Robin. But later on I came to Brisbane, and then I had, my first thing was probably sometime in the 2000s to look at QPAC and its lack of disability access and how we would deal with that. So I went to see Robin and had brought him ideas of how I think things could be. And so I reckon we met, 15 times, but he would always ask whenever I put a concept up to him, and he'd look at it suspiciously, and he'd always say, "And what does Philip think of that?" I don't really need Philip's approval, whatever. But he seemed to think that he and Philip and perhaps Harry Seidler and Darryl Jackson were on this kind of level, and I was probably somewhere well down below. So I'd say, I'll ask him. And then I'd go to the next meeting and said, "Philip said it's okay." "Oh, all right then." So, yeah, it was good interaction.
Yeah, well, we've heard a few stories from some of the staff members that worked in the office that had sort of similar experiences where they'd come up to Robin with all right, this is what we should do. And Robin would just sort of outwardly say, "No, not going to do that." And eventually they'd keep pushing it. And eventually Robin would sort of come back and say, "That problem with the stairs, I think we should do this." And it would be exactly the same suggestion that these poor architects had suggested months before. But Ruth, the Cultural Centre was, of course, heritage listed in 2015. So what were some of the reasons that it was considered so significant?
Well, it covers most, of the 8 criteria under the Queensland Heritage Act. It was listed as significant for 7 of those criteria. And the criteria, and I apologise, you may all be familiar with the criteria, but they cover historical significance, rarity, demonstrating principal characteristics of a particular class of place, aesthetics, high degree of technical achievement, special association for social, cultural or spiritual reasons, life and work of a particular person or organisation. So it ticks the boxes on all of those, and there's quite lengthy description of why it's significant if you look it up under the Department of Environment and Science website. So it really, the only one it didn't have was archaeological significance. And initially I thought, hang on, wharves used to be there. There's all of Brisbane's early history. But of course, with Expo and the work that's been done on that site to date, most of that had gone. And that is, in some respects, a bit of a lost opportunity for Brisbane, that we haven't really picked up on that early history. There is the Maritime Museum and the dock, but it's struggling as well. So it would be good for Brisbane, I think, to move in the direction of actually picking up on some of that history, because it's not all about the cultural centre, even though that's what we're talking about today. But, there are a lot more layers that we need to, I think, pick up on. But did you want me to talk about some of the particular?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Architectural is pretty obvious. I'm going to read some of this, I'm sorry, but it's the citation, which is the state heritage citation for it, says, outstanding significance to the state for its distinctive architectural qualities, monumental scale, prominent siting, and its many public art installations, which you forget about. But as you walk around, the amount, the sculpture and the works, that has continued to a small degree, but it was a big step forward for Brisbane at the time to have, the sculpture within the gardens that you could actually walk around and touch. Popular tourist destination and inspirational for photographers and artists. Large cohesive complex of buildings and spaces unified by its cubic forms, structural detailing and fine quality finishes, fixtures and furnishings. And that's so true, isn't it, Michael? I mean, again, it wasn't value managed out. I mean, they're quite expensive finishes that were in that building that gave it the class and the attributes that we look for today in so many. And a beautiful palette, colour palette that's it's refined, it's subtle, but it does change.
Absolutely.
And it's
very few buildings have that consistency of quality through all their elements through to its finishes. Usually something gives way to pay for something else. But
especially over like the duration that it was constructed, because construction sort of started 76 or something, and then the Playhouse Theatre wasn't added until 98 or something, and you look at the whole thing over 20 years of construction,
to
and
keep
it's
it
just
going.
But he even designed some of the furniture. Particularly the museum and the art gallery still have some of that furniture. A lot of it has gone over the years, but won't now. Whatever is left will be retained. But the detail that he was allowed to go into, and for a government project, it's, I think, a testament to his powers of persuasion.
Powers of persuasion, and also
he did work with a fairly high connection to government and other organisations in the city that allowed him to do
the respect to do it.
Yes,
that's right.
But I'm just interrupt there, but I'm just wondering if that's also got to do with, it's unusual that he was allowed to, it was such a high quality building and then he was given the go ahead to do this. But I think it was also an indication of what the importance of the building was to Brisbane. Brisbane hadn't had a home for its national art collection for a long time, permanent home, and this was something that was debated for a long time. It didn't have really good facilities for putting on good shows and concerts, and I think the arts has always been really quite important to Brisbane and to Brisbane's identity. I'm researching some scholars from the 1940s, and it's all about art and architecture and how to cultivate the citizen and to cultivate a cultured citizen too. So the role of the arts has always been really quite central, I think, to Brisbane's identity. And this was the first time you got a building in one place or a complex in one place where they can say, oh, well, we've done it now. We now put on the world-class shows and the world-class exhibitions. And it was a bit of a coming of age, I suspect. Much in the same way that Expo is often cited as a bit of a coming of age for the city. I think the cultural centre and the cultural complex was also. And it seems to be appreciated at the government level too, that, and possibly that's why it was allowed to develop. Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you look at Brisbane pre the cultural centre complex, it had its cultural buildings had developed similar to other cities. Like, you know, you had a couple of rather beautiful 19th century theatres in Queen Street. And there, you know, you had the museum building at Bowen Terrace. So, you know, they were dotted around the city. So there was a cultural life.
There was.
But the idea of bringing it all together into space where people can spend the whole day just is a different experience.
Mind you, there's a whole lot of other discussion, isn't there, about the fate of those other buildings that were spotted around.
Yes,
you know,
that's right. Yeah,
yeah, but the exhibition building was never built as an art gallery. It was built as an exhibition building.
Yeah, it wasn't
and
used
so it was
as an
a
art,
temporary art gallery museum. It was always seen as a temporary. And I think it was that the idea that this collection has a permanent home was really, really important.
Yeah. No, that is true. So yes, I won't go into more detail about the aesthetics, but I think, you know, just from what we've said, and I'm sure the audience, you know, that's why you're interested in the building. I mean, it is just a beautiful building to walk around and within it, and it's the spaces outside and the layering up from the river, which was most unusual, as you said, Deborah, that Brisbane hadn't really done that before, actually embraced the river. In fact, they turned their back on the river. And some of even the 50s apartment buildings at New Farm face north, which is great orientation, but totally turned their back on the river. It wasn't seen as an asset. And so Robin Robin Gibson turned that around and made people realise. And I really miss the fountain that used to be
It's out on the screen out there.
You know, there was talk about bringing it back. I don't know if there's any discussion about that. It was, what was it, the dirty Brisbane water sort of?
Yeah, we've been told it just kept silting up.
Yes.
Oh, is this the one on the river?
Yes.
Yeah.
The guys.
There's also the one in QPAC. That's the Cascade fountain as well. That's been
the wood room.
The wood.
Robert Woodward.
Yes.
I've never actually seen that work. I'd love to see that in action.
It was beautiful.
Yeah, well, I remember as a kid sort of going in and sort of sticking your hand in the in the running water.
But they've still got over on the art gallery. There are still the external fountains that exist and are being maintained. And I do think the government is ultimately looking to bring back.
Oh, I hope
the
so.
Robert Woodward one, which was really quite.
I think
beautiful.
that would really enliven that space, because it seems to be a bit of a dead public space now.
Yes.
And while the gallery and the State Library have taken over from that space, so if you put that fountain back there, it just. I've seen some of the original photos. It just looked like an amazing space when that fountain was going.
And that was another big first for Brisbane, just bringing in all these acclaimed artists to do the fountains and the sculpture and the external works. And there was the seating in the landscape. The rubbish bins were purpose designed, you know, and it was just beautiful together.
So what sort of these elements did you then sort of pass on to the people that were doing the competition? Was there a sort of short list of...
Yes.
this is for the architectural competition for the new performing arts venue.
Well, initially I put a report together for government, but by that stage, of course, Conrad Gargett had prepared, an architectural firm, had prepared a conservation management plan, and then went on to prepare a management protocol for the building after it was listed. And that was giving assurance to the government entities who were looking after those buildings that it wasn't, you know, to be kept in paper, you know, and not touched, that things could change, and the level of change that would be acceptable or unacceptable And it went through in quite some detail, and you would have looked at that many times, Michael. I'm sure the methodology, which is, I think the covers of the books are on one of the slides, backwards or forwards of that, Catherine. But it's the CMP and the methodology. But there they are. They're just the covers. So the methodology in particular was looked at all the fabric, which is walls, windows, carpets, the furniture, the fittings, the joinery, and listed them out, significant, not significant, and throughout the whole complex. Now, the library isn't included in the citation. I understand it was felt at the time by the Heritage Council that it had already had significant changes because Donovan Hill had done quite a bit of work, and so it was seen as not part of that sort of homogeneous group. But certainly those documents were already there, and from that I really just put together all the information that I could in terms of we found the early lecture by Robin Gibson, which he gave at the Queensland Club. I'm trying to think of the name of it, that I referred to in the report. Aquinas.
Yeah, Aquinas.
The
Aquinas.
lifestyle and the built environment.
Yes, where he talks about his philosophy. So we brought all of this together to provide a background without not being prescriptive at all, just saying, well, look, this is what's significant and how you might deal with it is in these documents. And so that's what was given to, we presented, or I presented to the teams a few times, I think, yes.
Yeah. So, Michael, in the design of the project, what sort of, as the successful winner of MPAV, what sort of these elements did you respond to in the design?
Quite a lot. Obviously, the pre-discussion we've just had is not about just picking this bit and that bit and that bit and doing it. It's about the cultural precinct and what it means. So I think prefacing some of the things that we did particularly is this kind of trying to understand the whole of the cultural precinct and indeed the change to the cultural precinct. There was no South Bank back then. Robin deliberately turned his back on the railway side because it was full of grit and railway and industry and so on. He had things about reflecting the hills behind, and we now know time's gone on and there's going on behind the cultural centre and the hills have been obliterated. So I think, Robin did say quite often and went to a lot of lengths to say buildings are a mirror of their time and other words to that effect.
Yes.
So I think he recognised that the cultural precinct was of its time and that it didn't necessarily mean that it was going to remain static while the world changed around it, and that change was inevitable. So I think, that was recognised in his comments. So I guess to us, and it comes to another question you're going to ask, but I'll kind of bring it in now if I can, which was what was the brief for the thing, and I'm only saying this to bring the question and answer together. The brief was a 1,500-seat theatre. It was on a site which had always intended to be an expansion site for a cultural facility, and we responded to a reference design that the government had prepared previously as well that showed that if it was going to go on that site, it needed to cantilever over footpaths on two flanks to fit it in. Given those kind of parameters, when we all did the competition, and lots of people wanted to win a competition, I don't know, 60 entries at the start or something like that, and it whittled down to 5, I think, competitors.
6, yep.
And so, it's a very significant project to win. It's great. I can't tell you how significant it is to win.
Yes, I mean, this is a once in a generation.
Yeah, and it's 20 years since Goma and so on have been built, so probably we're going to do it every 20 years. So it's really a wonderful privilege to be able to do this building. And the respect for the Gibson building came in a number of ways. We looked at the cantilever. I don't know if the picture can come up, but thanks, Catherine. Say that one will do. But the fact that it needed to have this extension out over the footpaths, our simple idea was kind of shown there with the addition in the darker brown timber where the block of the building which surrounds and frames the actual auditorium aligns with the two frontages on Grey Street and on Russell Street with the Playhouse and the Lyric Theatre. And then the addition is a kind of lightweight veil or veranda that's added to it that you can see through to the alignment of the old Gibson building. So that was probably one of the first really important things, which I hope's conveyed by those things. Their respect for scale really wasn't hard because the building didn't need to be bigger than the other theatres particularly. So being able to do that, but we also brought in the things about, so that picture's a good one, horizontal cubic forms came up repeatedly, which those elevations demonstrate through there. So they do have this kind of crisp horizontal cubic form, not intruding into the building more than we needed to, into the existing building. Two of the large part of the playhouse flank and almost all of the loading dock flank were painted and ready for change.
Yeah, I think, Catherine, there's an earlier image of roofs.
There is an image, yes.
Yeah, which was good. So
that
they were.
conveys it really well.
Yeah, and if I can just, so, I mean, it was painted blockwork and really finishes ready for that next stage. It was always intended to be a next stage, but the problem was that the initial, before the playhouse, a scheme was done to cover that whole site. But then government decided, no, it wasn't large enough in terms of the theatre. So they only built half but a larger theatre, which left a section over that was never built upon. It was called the Playhouse Green, but it was a bit of an unloved space. It was being on the southeastern side of these large buildings. It was in shade. It wasn't a very friendly space, unlike a lot of the contemplative spaces that are around the rest of the complex. And so it was not a characteristic Gibson space, just waiting for the new facility. But the problem was it was always going to be small and it was never really looked at in terms of, well, what could they fit there? But the way the whole QPAC, sorry, Michael, the way it's grown is that government and you know, there are good and bad with these things. They're always looking to get, do we need a larger theatre? We can get more shows into Brisbane, you know, and then we can have more diverse shows if we have different size theatres. And so there is a benefit to having increased the size of the first building in the playhouse. And again, in this one, to stay, the seating capacity has stayed
1,500, yeah.
Yep, since, which there was a lot of controversy about, well, it should be smaller, but then they wanted the flexibility of having a variety of spaces to get the shows to give Brisbane, you know, the experiences of different cultural events. So, and always still coming back to having that contiguous loading dock or back of stage in the centre, which is actually one of the most significant parts of how the thing runs.
Just about the main driver.
And the envy of many theatres throughout Australia and the world. It's such a significant element. So,
sorry, the other things were a limited palette of materials, which obviously we've discussed earlier there. So that's been maintained here. It's almost all precast concrete, glass, and bronze hardware, and Robin Queensland maple, which is not a sustainable timber. So we're not using Queensland maple, but using grey ironbark, which is a sustainable timber. So that was a significant thing. Natural light and the way natural light penetrates through the other buildings of Gibson's. We've explored in our own way, I guess we could say it that, but there are 7 skylights that are in the roof of it, and I think if I can probably finish with just anything else that I've missed there. The stepped roof is more so than you see on that section now. The 3-metre grid is something, but it's more of a conundrum to us because the 3-metre grid's a discipline that Robin put down, but physically only 26% of his building's actually on the 3-metre grid. So the grid's there, but then he didn't have a problem adjusting to the grid. The important thing is he used the grid in the first place, and when he made an adjustment, he knew how its relationship to the grid was, rather than slavishly adopting it. So we've done exactly the same thing. I've got a piece of paper here that sort of shows you our discipline, but we worked quite a bit with Alan Kirkwood on that before obviously Alan died. So we did have a really good interaction with people, and we had a guy called Gary Carter in office who worked on the original QPAC building as well. So that's how we were able to pick up a lot about not just, an archival thing, looking at it. We actually understood how and why Robin used those things, and it was a really important part of the discipline through there. The only other thing I want to say about heritage while we're on it is First Nations heritage, because pretty much forgotten in buildings pre 2010 maybe. including this, but the facade that we created here has been done because we think it's going to be exciting. We think people will look into the building and see cultural activity and cultural life. But a poem came up by an Aboriginal elder called Auntie Lilla Watson as we were trying to think about the competition, and it talked about the Brisbane River and it's shimmering and looking in it and seeing fish and then blurring of the way you look through water. And that's really how that facade kind of started to generate. And part of it was that, part of it was embedding a spirit of First Nations people into the building rather than let's do the building and let's talk to some artists later and add some sort of, I don't mean the word tokenistic badly, but you know, that's often what happens. So we were trying to embed meaning into the building at the beginning. And I mentioned the seven skylights in the roof, and we did that actually, frankly, because we thought this is the beautiful light, but we're going to get into it and cast it down walls. And then the Auntie Colleen Wall from the QPAC pointed out there are 7 water catchments in Queensland. And I was about to say something about the contractor. We were going to lose some of these things. You know, they get value managed out, as you know. So we kind of knew that the 7 skylights might get under attack as a value management item that was nice to have, not essential, until Auntie Colleen pointed out the 7 water catchments, and we could have hugged it, you know. Thank you.
At what point did that come out, Michael?
A fair while ago now.
Yeah.
Sort of when the contractor came on, I suppose, mid last year.
Yeah.
And written quite a big text about it, about the 7 water catchments, how important they are, and the green time stories, and how the stories bring all those catchments together. Yeah. So our 7 skylights are symbolic of those. We'll take it. I'm sorry, I'm being confessional by saying it wasn't in our brain at the very beginning. I was
thinking, I couldn't remember that story from the competition presentations.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that First Nations heritage, and I think much greater emphasis in the future on First Nations inclusivity and acknowledgement of country coming into public buildings.
Yeah. On a sort of like more global scale, you've got Norwegian practice Snøhetta working on the project with you as well. So what did they sort of bring to the mix?
The first thing about that was that I don't think it was meant to be an international competition, but I think the Deputy Premier at the time said it on radio, and suddenly, despite anybody wanting not to do that, it was the way it was. So everyone architects ran around looking for people. I'd had a relationship with Snøhetta since I was a creative director of the National Architectural Conference 2012, and I just maintained that relationship because I liked the guys, and so we just talked. So it wasn't me sort of ringing them out of the cold saying, hey. We had kept a dialogue going through the sort of previous 7 years, and notwithstanding, you sort of seem to need an international. They have an immense amount of performing arts experience. So, the primary reason for wanting them there is, even though we'd done some theatre work, this new facility has to do world-class opera, world-class ballet, world-class symphony, musicals, musical theatre, and drama. So it's really versatile, and you might think that sounds easy, but if you can imagine the acoustic changes that go on between those modes of performance, it's highly technical. John Kotsis called it, it's its own musical instrument, and he's right, because there's so much finessing that goes into this kind of project. So I think so much emphasis gets on the building and the look of it and all those sort of things, but they're actually a tuned instrument that has to work incredibly well and has to last. So many innovations came in that Snøhetta were able to help us with in that regard. But at the beginning of the project was really just a workshop process between us and those people, and we didn't kind of worry about who was from which firm. It was just lots of young people and harder-headed people coming together and doing it. The idea of that veil really came from the workshops initially, with this poem that Auntie Lilla had come up, but I guess was more our doing than Snøhetta's doing in the creation of that and responding to that poem, and that's kind of how that came about. But it actually came up very early in our workshops, even though we then looked at other things, we kept coming back to it.
Great. So I guess we live in a sort of different world now with COVID. Has that sort of interrupted the development of the project at all?
Not in progress. The main thing that's disrupted was the loss of subcontract tenderers that can supply the elements. So the glass, for instance, we had, because it's curved glass, it's 7 metres high, it's quite incredible technologically to do it, but we had about 6 companies overseas that could do it prior to COVID, and I think we ended up with 2 that were capable of doing it, which meant that the tender competition had fallen away, and that kind of threatens your whole cost plan when they realise they've only got one competitor. So that's probably the main thing we've had to deal with through COVID.
Yeah. So you mentioned before about the sort of transparency of the facade and that sort of bringing people, sort of drawing a connection between the person on the street and the activity in the building. That, I guess, is sort of something that Robin Gibson was trying to do as well. So I think, Deborah, there's that lovely quote about the Thong Brigade. Robin having this sort of thrill going to the art gallery as when it first opened and seeing small children and what he called the Thong Brigade, the people, like the blokes walking around in stubbies and thongs, actually like enjoying the art. So,
and if you're lucky, they had a singlet on. Yeah, I think he took, from what I've read and from what's been reported, he seemed to take incredible pleasure from that people coming to see art in the art gallery, and it was everyone, it was the masses, it was a sort of he sort of felt, I suspect, it was a sort of a democratisation of the whole sort of the high arts, for want of a better word, in Brisbane. And I think that was a big part of the program for him, even though he didn't pick the site was picked for him, but it was in South Brisbane. He was born and bred and grew up in South Brisbane. South Brisbane, I suspect, was at that time not seen as quite the right side of the city, the north side of the city. There were certain class things going on. So there's some interesting plays.
Which side, you grew up in, I think. You need to be a bit careful there.
I suspect, I've only read about this, but I suspect there was a bit of a, I think he was quite proud he came from the south and that he was pulling the south back into the city, is my impression. He really loved the city as well, but he was pulling the south back into the, and I feel part of the complex now. It's talking of early impressions, I should have mentioned this before. One of my first impressions of that whole complex was, and Goma as it all came up, was that there's this art cultural complex, but then there's a milk factory next to it. Now coming from Sydney, you wouldn't see that. Sort of, I think that's what the really interesting thing about Brisbane is. Their suburbs are quite diverse. Their places are quite diverse. They're not sort of. It's now becoming a bit different, and becoming more gentrified. But there was quite a lot of diversity in individual suburbs. And I think that was part of the cultural complex too. I think it was a really nice idea. I don't know if that's the quote you're talking about, but
I just think it's kind of interesting that there's still that sort of lineage of like trying to draw in the sort of general public into the facility in some way. Yeah.
Well, I think that the different institutions there have been very successful in doing that
programming,
and bringing the people in. So they are not just used. I used to go weekly, if not twice weekly, to the State Library to work. But the place was always packed with students using the Wi-Fi, mums and with their kids coming for coffee and having coffee in the cafe. And so it was also, it was a place where you came and did your research, but it was also very much a place that everybody in the city was using at that time too. So, and I like your description as the art gallery is the contemplative space, because when I wanted to escape that from the State Library, I always went to the library, to the gallery.
The sanctuary.
Into that very cool, quiet space, which I always thought was quite lovely. I think I've gone off track. Ask me another question. I'll come back to that.
Well, I guess it sort of speaks more of like the sort of changing nature of these cultural institutions that perhaps there were, like the library, for instance, is a different building than what it was when Robin Gibson designed it. Like there's had to have been changes to sort of remain in step with.
Well, I think the public space, and again, this is before my time, so I'm not sure how it worked. Maybe you could speak more to this, Ruth. But the public space he envisioned as part of that original scheme was the art gallery, mall type, that looked towards the river and looked back towards the city. So it was almost like he was trying to get the public there, but then turn their backs on South Bank and look back at the river and look back at the city. That space now seems to get a bit deserted, I think, because of the changes, and now it's redirected them into the spaces of the State Library. Well, I know personally I hardly use that space as sort of the public space that it was originally designed for. Yeah. And I think in QPAC and the theatre, similar to the idea I think you've pulled up with the Vale, you can see from the street the activities happening within the gallery. The public, you can see from the street that the things are happening in the theatre. And I think that's the original opening slide we had of the stairs of QPAC had a very similar function for Gibson. It was a place for people to be seen and to see, and then again to turn around and look back across the river to the city. Yeah, so that sort of took on it wasn't just the space that you got to your different theatres. It did that, and it did that well, but then it also took on this different function. And I think that's really quite an interesting aspect about his work. And I remember doing the research for the book, as you did, Lloyd, and some of the newspaper articles talking about people being the essential ingredient in his schemes. So it was they just weren't spaces, but they were spaces that people would move through and experience, and he would set up vistas. And I think that conception is a really interesting one. It's one that it's this idea of movement. It seems to be almost essential. And people moving through these spaces seems to be essential to all these different schemes.
But I guess there's sort of movement of water as well. That's just. So, Michael, what's the sort of the public response been to the new theatre?
It's funny you say that because, as Ruth sort of alluded to about the Playhouse Green, I still say to people, doing this project, and they go, "Where is it?" And they go, it's on that green part, and they go, "Where is that?" So it's under construction. It seems to me it's not actually terribly understood.
You notice it now, Michael, because you used to get blocked in the traffic. Now they're noticing.
Absolutely. Well, no, but they don't know why. They still don't know why. There's just something. Roadworks are happening over there, I guess.
I got stuck there the other night. I thought,
So it's difficult to judge, Lloyd, the public response till it's really, really happened. So, I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be a great theatre. I really think it'll be fantastic. I wouldn't mind just showing a slide, if I can, Catherine, about just related back to publicness, the cross section through the building. No, one more. Yeah, that one there. I don't know if you can see that too well. This is the competition entry, so it's slightly changed, but the principle's still the same. But we were the only competition entry that put. So there were 2 rehearsal studios in the existing building, which some schemes demolished and then would have had to replace in the new building, and they, from memory, put them on top of the roof. We thought there was a greater opportunity because once they're on the roof, they're just rehearsal studios that ballerinas use. So, and then they tended to put restaurants down on the base under the theatre. But that little pinky area down there is where we put the rehearsal studios instead. And the reason for that is that you could walk along the street, on Grey Street on Grade, but also on Russell Street, and look and see rehearsals happening. So our idea of sort of getting much more cultural interaction with the public realm was let people see it. Of course, you can pull a curtain if it's private things, but that means it can also be a performance space. So school groups, community arts, and all those things can happen. So there's continuity of things rather than it just being something on the top that gets occasionally used as a pre-performance space. So that was our kind of big move from a public relationship point of view, and that's been maintained. But funnily enough, we then did that, and then we kind of realised that the existing rehearsal studios that we had to connect to, building 2, you probably don't know them, but they were on that playhouse side, really only needed to be as big as the actual stage area, and they were bigger than the stage area. So I think we were the only scheme that actually maintained, I'm sure we're the only scheme that maintained those 2 there and didn't demolish them, and provided 2 more. And I do remember doing the jury day for the presentation. This is stories out of school again. But when we did the presentation for the competition, and I explained the philosophy, and Auntie Lilla's sort of, stimulus for everything and all the things you do to explain your scheme. And then one of the judges came up afterwards and said, "Oh, can you tell me how many studios we've got?" And I thought, that's my whole slate. That's my whole 4. I spent half an hour trying to explain it. And nevertheless, that was a big one, because it's not only great for, to have the best 4 rehearsal studios for once is fantastic, but the revenue obviously is really important to keep back and self-funding. But I think that to me is a real sort of game changer of getting this ability to use things that sound very kind of prosaic elements as really participatory things with the city, and really looking forward to that.
It was actually quite controversial, I think, at the time. There was a lot of concern that the studio spaces could be demolished, because actually under the Conservation Management Plan and the management protocol, it said that it wasn't the actual space but the use that was significant, which gave people the opportunity, or all the architectural firms in the competition, the opportunity to, and most did, demolish. They can only go on the documentation that was prepared, and I think that's reasonable. I think it's really commendable that they were retained, and I think that was a big plus. The studios themselves are lovely spaces in terms of the detail, which wasn't considered significant in the CMP and the protocol. But they did have the balconies overlooking the Playhouse Green. Now, it would always have been known that those balconies would go, and they would no longer have the opportunity for that space. And a studio, I think it was actually there as a sort of an earlier form, doser, smoking area, actually, because they weren't used. The curtains were drawn, and when they were doing practices, it was only as a studio, not as the balcony overlooking the Playhouse Green. And so that was always going to go, because it was known something would be built there. But I think it's great that those studio spaces, and just a question, the ceiling and some of the fittings, is that all being retained?
All of it's retained, It's only we truncated the end facing us, so that's new, but all of the existing
which I think
details still there.
Is a terrific outcome, because I do think that some of the detail in those spaces
it's brilliant, particularly in the studios.
Those ceilings are amazing.
Yes,
gridded.
They are
quite a surprise. So pity for the public not to be able to experience.
But they would have never been able to experience them, because they were just
sorry, everyone.
Spaces, so I'm really pleased. I think that's a terrific plus.
Thanks. So the way we've just designed it is you come into the foyers, but you can go to those existing studios as performance spaces too. So they have their own foyers now to them, which they didn't have previously. So the
opportunity will be there for the public.
All 4 can be actual performance spaces as well as rehearsal.
I suppose the sort of last question is really like what's next for the site. It was interesting that you mentioned before, Ruth, that the State Library wasn't part of the heritage listing because it had been sort of altered so much, whereas the NPAV is a much more sort of sensitive design, and so I suppose that we're going to see more of that style of thing. I mean, cultural centres have to evolve, like that's what happens, and so how is the architecture then going to, this is a big question, how is the architecture going to kind of continue to maintain the heritage aspects of the project while sort of speaking to these new and developing cultural needs? Because maybe that's a kind of rhetorical question.
Well, there isn't much site left in terms of major new buildings. There was always talk of putting office space at one point in the future between the 2 fly towers. I don't know if that's ever going to come off. But
no, that didn't seem. Structurally, it's not sensible. It could happen, but I very much doubt.
So there aren't too many opportunities left on the site unless they start to subsume more of South Bank. But then the ABC building is there. It would be quite difficult. And yes, they will change. I mean, just because it's listed doesn't mean it can't be changed. And that's why we've got the Conservation Management Plan and the protocol document. So it will change. It will be interesting to know. I mean, there'll always be a backstage, you think? I mean, are we going to go virtual for all our performances in the future? Is it going to be, like the universities when everything's online? Are they going to become obsolete? I somehow doubt it, but then I'd hope not. That interaction with the performance. To lose that is to lose so much of the experience. So
I think experience is still going to be time immemorial. Really do. I think if you give beautiful sound and beautiful form, I don't think people are ever going to not want that real tactile experience of being there. The whole emphasis of this theatre, by the way, here is large part of it is to get much closer audience performer interaction than even in the lyric and concert. So the front to back from the stage to the back of the theatre is only 27 metres, which is 5 metres longer than the cricket pitch, say. But that's because we've got balconies wrapping right around. So there's this kind of almost William Hogarth-like
intimacy.
The intimacy that people are craving. So to me, that's kind of evidence that theatres aren't going away. People want this incredible atmosphere and feeling of being there with other people and a kind of big community in the one space, and performers want it too. So
theatres also have a character to them, like a Baroque theatre in Vienna sounds different to a Robin Gibson designed theatre in Brisbane.
Quite. So you would hope that digitalism is going to kill it. So,
One thing I would personally like to see, and it's not so much just about fitting in more buildings into that area, and I know when shows are on, they're quite lively spaces, but when shows aren't on, it's transition space, I think, between South Bank and the art galleries and the library. The libraries and the art gallery areas seem to be very lively and not always related to what's happening within the library, those spaces. They're a public space in their own right almost. And I'm wondering if that can be also done for the stuff on the other side of the road. And I suspect that's got a lot to do with like the fountains all off, and because if you start to revive some of those spaces, it'll bring the people back in. It might be a matter of getting free Wi-Fi, but that would be nice to see too. I think he's getting the South Bank itself is very lively, art gallery, the libraries are all very lively, but unless there's a show on, the theatres seem to be quite a fairly quiet space when there's not a show on.
So that's what that's trying to change, but as I said, by putting the rehearsal studios that can then do lots of other things. So then the glamour performance might be in the 1,500 seat theatre, but if you have something of that scale, it can be all sorts of school concerts and all sorts of things to try and get continuity hired and then happen
in fact, it's
every
that
day,
back corner
hopefully.
of the QPAC too, I think is kind of interesting because then it connects back into Grey Street and the restaurant zone and the
Exactly.
But I mean, that wasn't there when Robin Gibson designed the rest of it. So like he was, as Michael said, deliberately sort of putting a bank on that on that aspect. But now it's full of shops and bars and stuff.
And things,
South Bank Corporation too is doing a new master plan, I believe, at the moment too. So it'd be kind of interesting to see what happens with that.
Yeah, I think the broader precinct, though, probably the question could relate to that, not only to QPAC. I don't know what other people think. I guess to me, I think that the museum's not big enough to be a proper state museum. It's roughly a third the size of what it ought to be.
Lloyd and I have talked about that
right.
too.
So I think, and it is the kind of part of the Gibson work that's sort of between the road and the gallery, and it only had its footprint to work with. So that's what it's been for all those years, and obviously it's an incredibly successful museum. But I think the expansion of it will have to come into thinking at some point because I just think it's too undersized. So then you come into this conversation about do you do what other cities have done and put just have natural history somewhere and a science museum somewhere else, as you find in Paris, and maybe end up with 3 museums. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. Probably helps the city because it gives different sort of magnets to go to. But someone might think that an alternative or an additional thing was extending the museum building itself longitudinally to over that sort of reed frontage to the library, that runs along Peel Street. So I think it's got, probably some expansion room that could be done sensitively to Gibson's architecture.
I think internally it also has, because I've worked on a few projects in the museum, they need to grapple with, do they keep all their storage and back of house spaces in that actual building, or are they relocated in some of the commercial buildings off site? So
Yeah.
there's a bigger
picture, yeah.
to be.
But you've probably got to decide first.
Eventually, it may need to
Yeah.
contemplate some expansion. But it's an interesting point how you might deal with that. But with any heritage listed building, as you know, you've had to deal with and how you deal with it. The idea is that, contemporary thought is that it should be different. It should be of its time. You should be able to see the difference, but have some materiality and connection. Which I think you've demonstrated. I mean, I know initially the glass curtain, it takes a little bit to think, oh, is it really detracting? And that was probably one of the thoughts that a number of people looking at it may have said. Is it too detracting from the cultural centre that it's actually impacting its significance? But when you understand the story and why it's working,
I think for us, as long as
you need to look at the whole picture to balance it.
I think Ruth nailed something, there is that, I think some people would think that copying is what that heritage means, and you just copy it and nothing could be worse. It demeans the existing building and it doesn't allow the new building to be of its age. So, I think you said being able to see the difference distinctly is really important. But from us, all those heritage principles that I just mentioned previously became important kind of drivers of every move that we made, but it has helped us go further. So if you look all the joints of Robin's 6 by 3.3, I think, panels of the concrete have all been lined up. So you will see all these lines of striation moving through our building that are also through Robin's building. So it might be a subtlety, and people might even not
maybe
understand
only for architects,
might be subliminal, but I think the subliminal thing will get you to go, oh yeah, this does have a continuity wrapping right around the whole corner. So it's been an enormous amount of work on the detail going into this building, not just those sort of, yes, we've got step forms, or yes, we've got limited materials, and yes, we've got a cubic, that's part of it, but it's more than that. And I hope that people really respect and see just how much effort the team's gone into with very subtleties that make a real difference about what's a very sophisticated outcome versus a kind of compliant one, so to speak.
Compliant, well, it always had to have a difference. You don't want to see that
compliant
extrusion.
by I mean just taking the elements and saying tick, tick, tick.
Oh, yes.
It's great to hear. Well, it's everyone's homework when the building's finished to look for these joint lines. Okay, we might sort of wrap up the kind of formalities of the discussion and move on to some questions. Did anyone have any from the floor?
Yeah, thanks. I guess as an interested architect, when the competition was announced, I thought to myself, well, I wonder what sort of things, people might bring forward. And it was probably because I knew I had an opinion when I saw all the schemes and I wanted to be effective and go, what can I do? And it was interesting to see Ruth's list. I think you prepared the list with a little design philosophy thing. The two things that I thought of before the competition schemes were presented were probably not on your list principally. And one of them was like, so things that are important in Gibson's work that I thought, which is this thing of mass and void, and then how we use that language to explore like light and shade and prospect and refuge. And the other one was the way he sort of used, he's got these articulated sort of shifting masses, but he's used orthogonal language to do that. So I just wondered, maybe you're a good one to answer this sort of, Lloyd, in terms of things that could be brought forward that will set up a nice dialogue with the existing, but still create room for the new architecture to have its own authentic identity. Do you think they're good things to explore, or are they different things that you think should have been explored?
I'm just trying to work out how to repeat that question for the... So the question, I guess, was whether there was aspects of the Gibson scheme that wasn't necessarily picked up in do you mean in the Michael's project?
I think across the board, you could say that applies to that one, but not just that one. In terms of, those sort of themes that, such as the mass and void and then the orthogonal articulation, what you think are the themes about the original work, which are,
Yeah, well, I think you picked up on it just there. Like, there's mass and void, and that sort of orthogonal, sort of horizontal aspect of the project. And I mean, I like photography, and so I spend hours kind of walking around the building, finding how the light and the shadows sort of play with each other at different times of day, and that sort of thing. So I think that was definitely an opportunity for some of the competition people to explore. But I suppose as architects, there's lots of solutions to a various design problem. And I suppose the ones that the competition entries that I've seen all sort of took on a slightly different way of approaching the problem. So
Very, okay.
Very,
Yes.
yes, yeah, definitely.
I think I can also say something to that, is that the cubic form is an important aspect, and I guess you alluded to that, but it can happen in a piece of glass, it can happen in a piece of concrete. And if you look at the history of modern architecture and Mies van der Rohe and everyone else, there's always been this thing, long this thing between glass architecture and transparency, and all sorts of Bruno Taut, I think, had all sorts of things about the wonderful new world of glass and transparency and manifestos and those sorts of things. So to us, we haven't done the concrete outside and the recessed glass. We've done the reverse, in effect. But our reason for doing that was that if we did the heavy block thing and then it went out over the footpaths, you would see a pretty kind of cruel building, I would say, to Gibson's buildings resulting from that. So that's why we reversed the thing, but it's a deliberate reversal, not an ignorant one, if you know what I mean.
But also, I think, the competition was limited to just a very small portion of the site, and a lot of the details that you're talking about, the recessed openings and the glass and the voids are across the site, and it's the interplay between the various buildings, whereas this competition only had that corner to deal with. So some things aren't going to be maybe as clearly expressed as you may see on other parts of the building. But I think a lot of philosophy is still embedded in the project.
There's a lot of thought gone into it. I think even the comment came up once about, the rippled facade creates vertical articulation, and but that's not unprecedented in Gibson's building either. It's got lots of precast vertical blades wrapping around its Grey Street and other side. So we actually picked up on that, looked at it and said, yes, he's worked that way. That'll kind of cater that we can continue around the corner, which there's a lot of thought just in every aspect of this.
If it's all right, I was just going to drop in a question that came in from online, and it's sort of about what you've been talking about, which was the glass facade. It says, in the forum of public discussion on social media, there are some comments over the glass facade's appropriateness for Brisbane's subtropical climate. Did you
Michael, you might have to take that one.
The glass facade, okay. I think it's probably misunderstood. I have seen those comments previously. Oh, it's glass, it mustn't be any good for the subtropics. That's pretty much the claim. It's just not a valid claim. It faces southeast and southwest. It's got two facades. On the southeast side, which is the one front on here, it gets summer sun directly only to about 9 o'clock in the morning in summer, and then no other direct sunlight. So the question of is it getting heat gain and so on, it does not. By proof of it. So that's why it can be glass, because it's largely south-facing. It gets glancing sun at a point in time, but it can be all glass without any reduction in its value. On the Grey Street side, which I don't know I have up there, it's got southwest facing. The rippling of it creates some western, is it? Yeah, replicates some western facing and some southern facing, because it's flat on the southwest. In truth, it only gets sun from around 2 to 4 p.m. in summer, so its main exposure is pretty low as well. If we were doing with west and western sun, very different situation, by the way. So it doesn't get lots of sunlight, but it does get heat gain. But I think what's not read in those drawings, because it wasn't done that way, is that all the western facades are actually kind of louvers, which stop sun coming in. So what it is the glass runs around, but the glass is 2 layers in its structure, and it was particularly 2 layers of laminated glass, and there's ceramic fritting, we call it, in the pieces that face directly west. I'm sorry if that sounds a bit boggling, but that's what's happening. So all of the western faces are all acting like a louver, which you would often add to a building, but in our case is integrated into the glass system, which is why you see it continually looking like glass. So I think there's just when people make that claim, it's a kind of big misunderstanding of what's actually happening, how much sun's coming in reality, as well as technologically how you can solve that these days. That may not have been the case 30 years ago.
I have 2 questions. Can you tell me the name of the lady who wrote the poem?
Auntie Lilla Watson. Lilla, L-I-double-L-A, Watson, yeah. Because I think well into her 80s and possibly close to 90 now.
The second one is, you mentioned the visibility of the rehearsal area for pass-bys. Sometimes when I walk down Grey Street behind the conservatorium, I hear music.
Yeah.
And I think that's fabulous. And I was just wondering, will we hear as well as see?
So I'll just repeat the question for the people paying attention. But the question from the audience was whether or not there would be a sort of a sound connection to the people on the street, as well as a visual connection to those rehearsal spaces that are sort of submerged slightly in the new scheme. Michael?
Sorry. There's flexibility to allow that to happen. It's also can be acoustically isolated if they want to rehearse and not have the sound transmit out, but there's mechanisms for letting the sound out as well, so it's a choice thing. Yeah.
And
that's a good point.
Actually, they do have that projecting. That was part of the the design of the building, as I understand.
But it's very seductive, isn't it? Very alluring to Yes.
It's not a very nice space, though, unfortunately. Yes.
Can I just ask about the skylights? So one of the elevations had light streaming into the theatre. That would obviously be covered when there's a show on. Like you strike the
there's no skylight coming into the actual theatre itself. The 7, it's just spotlight. The 7 skylights. There are some theatres that do that around the world, but probably to their detriment, as you can imagine. But there are some, usually Chinese ones, they love to kind of designing them so you can let the theatre be flooded with light now, but that takes a lot of control to turn it back to performance quality. But the 7 skylights that we've got are all coming into the foyer thing, and so we're sort of also working with different First Nations groups and advisors to get this whole program to work, from kind of welcome to country as you arrive at the building, or welcome to building related to welcome to country, and then tying that to the meaning of the 7 skylights in the roof as a kind of continuous narrative as you go up. So that's really the biggest current emphasis that we're working on.
Is this where we can go to the details that you think?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's 2 good points now. You're right. It'd be good if there was a forum somewhere, wasn't it? There's certainly a good model made of it now, which you can see in the foyer in the Lyric, outside the Lyric.
I think that it's all online, right?
Quite a big one. So
there's information on your website, and I think the Arts Queensland has their own.
Oh, there's stuff you can find, but I thought you were talking about all that detail that we've been talking about. Yeah.
I think the poll is even on Michael's website from memory. Yeah.
I hope so. And even those things happen sometimes by a bit of accident. That thing was, I knew Auntie Lilla about 20 years ago, because the curator said, "Oh, come and see Lilla," and lived in West End, so I went around there. Loved her work. She often worked with kind of burning stick. So she burnt, it was kind of dock work, but it was burnt dock work. And it was really beautiful kind of soot type things. So I bought a work off her. And then when you come much later, 20 years later, you know, it's just the way things can happen sometimes. And we were trying to think of what do we do, whatever. And somehow Lilla came back into my mind from actually only the lucky accident of meeting her and buying something off her 20 years before. That's then influenced this design in a huge way, as I've mentioned, which kind of may have never happened if you hadn't A, recollected it and B, done it. So it's architecture. I know, you know, I do architecture, but it's pretty, if you looked at a lot of buildings, it's probably fascinating, some of the stories about how they've come about, some of which might be purely accidental things that have just come into your mind. I do lots of kayaking on the river, for instance, and, you know, going along, you know, and then suddenly I go, I've got it. I've got to get a piece of paper. So it's often how it happens, yeah.
I think we had a gentleman on the floor.
Yes, probably the panel felt that the imminent arrival of the Neville Bonnet Bridge just on the forecourt, the sculpture court there, in fact was a great opportunity for the centre Aurora.
So the question there was whether or not the upcoming Neville Bonnet Bridge, which is linking the casino development on the north bank of the river with the south bank, and it's going to arrive just about where the wheel of Brisbane is, as I understand it, and whether or not that new development will have any impact on the scheme. Was that sort of something that, I mean, you must have been aware that that was coming. Was that something that you, sorry, Michael, that you made sort of allowances for or sort of factored into the design?
I hadn't just realised then that our engineer for the project has just asked the question.
Oh. Sorry.
This is Ian Ainsworth from Arab, who's been working with us all the way through. Look, I think the Neville Bonnet will bring a lot of movement across the river, and it aligns with Russell Street. So there will be this spine that it does generate of activity, and then with the metro station being put in, it'll draw lots of movement between them. So I think we'll, 10 times the amount of foot traffic on that corner. So the corner's become really important as a kind of pivotal point, almost as a new gateway into South Bank as people come along Grey Street from the station and then go into South Bank, but also cross the Neville Bonnet. So that's its really big significance. So I think that's another reason for kind of trying to maximise the publicness and public interface and transparency of this building, that it does look like something with the lights are on and it's really inviting and powerful. So yeah, I think the Neville Bonnet thing's going to have a very positive movement influence and set up a new dynamic for that part of South Bank. And the linking between, I guess, that thing between here's South Bank and here's the cultural precinct, but they're kind of the one thing from a publicness point of view. So I think that movement will help sort of blur that's activity, because I think, the cultural forecourt, to my mind, hasn't been well utilised over the years. It's kind of something you cross from what was Victoria Bridge when you could cross it, and you got into South Bank at the other end of the forecourt. So I think the greater activity that will happen there too will be a legacy of the Neville Bonnet Bridge.
The only real issue with it is, I think, the construction of those three major projects all at the one time, and how the pain that's starting to be experienced in that area in terms of traffic and access and construction sites and everything else.
Totally. But proof's in the pudding. Well, there are projects, I must say, that I've driven past around the place, and what annoying. Squishing the lanes down like this, and I'm waiting here, and sorry, I'm going to be late. And then I go, oh, it's my project.
Catherine, we've just gone past 12 o'clock. Do we want to do one more question or try to wrap it up? Okay. Cool. We might pull up stops there. Thank you for the other panellists for joining me today, and thanks to the Queensland State Archives, for hosting us, I guess, as well. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, no, I just really wanted to say thank you so much to all our panellists today for for coming out on a Saturday morning. It's been so enjoyable, and really thank you for your time and sharing your expertise and your interest. And thank you to our online viewers as well as the people coming out today here to Runcorn. And I was just going to end on this note, which was to say that the Queensland State Archives has recently digitised some fabulous archival footage, which if you're here in person, you've probably seen out in our foyer, but it's also available on our YouTube.